Topic for today is, am I really included, sitting way out there? And whereas inclusion was a hard thing to measure before 2019, it certainly became even harder to measure, track, and drive in the new normal that we're in, because we've got some people that are reporting to a location and we've got some people that are remote. And out of sight, out of mind now adds to the ability to just kind of forget people. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is how organizational networking analysis tools can be used to remedy that. They can be used to measure who's sitting out there in that little bubble away from the hubs of activity that are happening over here. And it can be used also as a way to measure progress in any actions that we take to correct that and to bring people in. So our guest today is Inga Carboni, Associate Professor at the College of William and Mary and author of Connected Dots. And Inga and I are old friends. We've done several interviews together. I feel like every time we do an interview, I learn something new. So I'm expecting to learn something new in this interview as well. So Inga, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it. And again, look forward to having this discussion with you.
Thank you for inviting me. I've always learned something from you, Joe, every time we talk. So this is always fun for me.
Oh, you're too kind. Thank you for that. So Inga, to start off, just tell us about how using organizational network analysis is a superior way to measure inclusion versus the surveys and those other tools that are used where people are asked to provide their perception of whether they're included or not.
Okay, I'll just start. I think most people are familiar with organizational network analysis. It's really become a mainstream way of looking at organizations. But for people maybe not as familiar, what it does is it maps out the way people are related to each other. So just like as in a formal organizational chart, you know who reports to who. This might be a chart of who's in the same meetings, who bills to the same project, who's on a shared email thread. Or it could be who indicates that they're friendly with someone or gets career advice from someone. It looks at those relationships, and it can be really different because I think everybody on this call knows that when you are talking about, who reports to who, the formal organization. But we all know that how work really gets done is, that this person is the one who's going to be able to get this done. And this person is the one that you got to talk to persuade for a project. And we all have that sort of in our minds. An organizational network analysis maps that out. So you can literally visualize it. You can see, the actors or nodes or people, and there's lines connecting them to show that there's relationships. So it's kind of what it looks like. And the nice thing about it is that there's underlying statistics so that it's not just anecdotal. You can say, this people who have their networks look like this are different from people who don't have their networks look like this, or people who have this characteristics are significantly different from people who don't have these characteristics. And I find that's a really useful aspect of it, especially for people who want the data and don't want to sort of hear feelings or, discontent in different areas, but want some hard data around it. So that's what organizational network analysis is. And I think most of us probably measure diversity and inclusion in one of two ways. So one, representation, and that's with the SNC and everybody, that's increasingly becoming mandated and transparent. So who do you have at every level and what are the characteristics of those people? Women, people of color, sometimes age, lots of different things. So we measure that in one way. And then the other primary measurement is to do some kind of engagement survey. I'm sure most people do a Gallup survey, but there's others out there. And then to sort of look, do people who are white have different responses than people of color, or do people who identify in this way have different levels of engagement than people who identify differently? And for the most part, those are the primary ways that we get information about diversity and inclusion. But I think what that really misses out on is this idea of how people are related to each other. So you can be pretty feeling pretty engaged and happy in a little pocket in the organization and not realize that all kinds of opportunities are passing you by because you're not in the hub of the network. And at the same time, you can have lots of diversity represented at upper levels in your organization, at all levels in your organization, but that doesn't capture the fact that that demographic doesn't feel like they're really part of the organization. They don't feel like their voice is heard. They don't feel like they're brought into the room where important decisions are being made. So this idea of mapping out the relationships and trying to see, do we see some systematic differences? Do we see people who resemble each other are on the periphery or are excluded from certain kinds of communications? Maybe not purposefully, but effectively. This is even more important in remote work because you can ask the same questions. And we know from the research that people who are remote, especially if you're new and remote, like you've been hired the last few years, you have a harder time getting into the organization and getting connected. It can take up to 6 years for a new hire to get embedded in an organization, to understand the sort of political aspects, to understand who to talk to get things done. And accelerating that is really important. So when you're remote, there's even a longer wave. And if you're not intentional, if the people who brought you in aren't intentional, it is really easy for newcomers and for quiet voices, people who have been traditionally disadvantaged, to get quieter and more disconnected. So I think ONA is a powerful tool for capturing those dynamics. And more than that, it allows for intentionality. So maybe there's parts of the organization that are doing great, but maybe there's parts that aren't. And it could be in the same unit, where there are some places, the pockets that are thriving and some that are not. And you can be very surgical about, all right, we need to address some of our challenges here, and we need to find out what's working so well over here. And I think it's also a great way to assess your return on some diversity investments. A lot of people have done unconscious bias training at this point. I've led unconscious bias training. It's literally $1 billion industry at this point. But is there a payoff? Is it changing anything? And you can capture that. You can take a look and you can say, hey, people who've gone through this training have more diverse networks than people who don't. Or you can just capture that. Or are more likely to be nominated as someone who gives career advice by a much more diverse group of people. So I think it's a powerful tool. I think we're going to see more and more of it being used. I already know many organizations that are starting to use it. And I think it gets at some of the problems that I hear from chief diversity officers, which is, all right, it still is hard to get representation, but we're getting clearer on what the path is to do that. But I'm still seeing people drop out 5 to 7 years after they come into the organization. And it's because they didn't feel deeply included in the organization. So I think it's a powerful tool. And I think it's just going to get to be more part of our basic toolbox as we move forward.
I've got to tell you, there's a couple of things that you said there that I think bear some underlining. And one of them is that it takes 6 years generally for a person to actually get into those different groups, to really bond into the organization, to know where to go, what to do. And that's when they're operating in the same building. So now you've got this other condition where this person is going to be working, let's say, remotely and may not have even that opportunity. So literally, a person can join a company and way before they reach that point where they have that bond with other people in the company and they're able to perform at that level, they may just say, hey, you know what, I'm out of here. They don't feel connected. And the other thing I think that you and I have talked a lot about is that what organizational network analysis tools measure is the actual place where the person interacts and sits within that organization's various hubs and communities of connection and communities of power, also of power sources. And I did this little caption in one of the articles that I did not long ago where I showed this person sitting there who thinks that they are, from a perceptual standpoint, thinks that they're included, but from a real standpoint, they're not. So everybody else in the organization has a relationship with the CFO. They work in the finance department. They don't. But if they were asked, are you included? They might perceptually think they are, but an x-ray of the company using organizational network analysis mapping tools would show that actually they're not, right? So this is a more realistic way of measuring, does that person have access to all those resources? And are they really in the inner circle or connected somehow to that inner circle? Or are they sitting in one of those dots all the way on the outside?
I'm just going to add in there that I think, I'm sure everybody who's listening to this is aware, but it's not just sort of being in the know. I mean, that's part of it. But there is so much research that supports the importance of having access to those really common everyday opportunities. Hey, did you know there's an opening? Someone's looking for a new person on their team. I'll put in a word for you. All those little things, they make the difference of people moving through an organization. Human capital aside, that social capital is critical.
So, Inga, you already went in one of the directions that I wanted to go, which is the importance of these tools in this new normal that we're living in, where you have a distributed workforce that's growing every day. Now you see almost as many jobs on LinkedIn and other sites like that for people who are going to work full-time remotely, and then others for part-time remotely. And those are competing with the ones where they're actually asking for someone to come into a workplace. So you mentioned how these tools have become even more important now. And I can really see that, especially when you threw that statistic out there about how it takes a person who's in the office, in that common workplace, 6 years to be able to work their way into those hubs of information and those hubs of power. What are some other reasons why this is becoming even more important that you see out there as the world becomes more distributed, as we become more multidimensional in our work? We were talking before about how I'm using tools to be able to collaborate and meet with people asynchronously because it's so hard to pull people's schedules together. So clearly it's more than just hybrid. We literally are experiencing the distribution of people across multiple dimensions of work. And I'd love to hear more about how ONA tools can ensure that that distributed workplace continues to be inclusive of everyone, and that when we take steps to make it more inclusive, to make it more equitable, that we have a way of actually seeing some kind of evidence that, yeah, this is working, or maybe we should do something else.
So the nice thing about ONA tools is that you can take the same measurements, or you can use the same tools, whether people are in the office or they're remote. Right. So if I'm asking you who do you turn to for career advice, doesn't really matter if you're sitting in the office or you're sitting remotely. You can still answer that question. You still have some people that you're turning to for career advice. So the actual tool, the location, the asynchronous, all that kind of stuff, just using the tool doesn't matter. And other people, I tend to use surveys. Some of my colleagues who are doing this might, scrape emails. They might look at billable hours, who worked on the same projects, those kinds of things. But whatever you do, you can do that whether it's remote or not remote. I think one of the challenges in our increasingly networked world, that's flatter, and we all know it, right? It's flatter. You're on multiple teams. You're working part-time on 6 different teams. You're distributed across the globe. You're distributed across time zones. You're in the United States. You're all over the place. One of the things that often happens is that people turn to the people that they know more than they turn to other people. So we're all familiar with that, and that gets exacerbated when these sort of things happen. And it's easier, for instance, to set. You've got a group in Pacific East Asia, and you want to set a regular meeting up, and you set the regular meeting up at 8:00, and there's a 12-hour time shift or something like that. It's always convenient for the people in New York, but it's never really convenient to the people in, in Singapore or something like that. So those those things are, you can see with a team. And some other work that I've done is taken a look at some of the things that cause dysfunction when teams are collaborating. And one of the signs is when there's sort of systematic exclusion, and it isn't always apparent. It isn't like you set out to say, oh, I don't want these people to join in. Once you're setting up meeting times, you're having impromptu Zooms when it's convenient for different people. Some people are able to come into the office and have a collaborative activity. As we move from work being a place to do work to a place for collaboration, I think that's the work of the futures. Offices are going to be collaborative spaces. And so we have to find a way to make sure that if we're going to work remotely, we have people who are included in that. So all of those things can be done, and those things can be assessed. The more you don't have daily bump into in the hall, see you at the cafe, greeting at the door, walking down the hall together, kind of casual interactions, more intentional it has to be. Otherwise, the tried and true become even more prevalent in your day-to-day exchanges. You go to what you know.
Yeah. So it sounds like these tools can be used again to do two things. One is to measure the current state of how people are connecting together in an organization, whether they're in the same building, different buildings, remotely working in different time zones. You can get that map and then be intentional about coming up with ideas of, well, how do we bring these people who maybe are in the outskirts of the map more to the center? How do we connect them more in? Come up with ideas about doing that, which that's a totally different discussion. But once we come up with that list of ideas, then after that, measure those connections and see, are these interventions working, or do we need to do something else? And always measuring to see if what we're doing is we're bringing people closer and closer together by using either technology tools or using opportunities to meet in person or to meet online, but to meet just to connect with other people that are in the organization. So all of that can be done intentionally once we know what it is that we're trying to do. And then we can measure again using these same tools. Is this stuff working? And one of the analogies that you used a while ago that comes back to mind in one of our many, many interviews that we've had, I don't know if it was interview 3 or 4 when this came up, but I think you said that organizational network analysis were like taking an X-ray of the actual relationships that exist in an organization. So literally you're taking an X-ray and then you're taking steps to heal and to connect whatever it is that you find that's disconnected. Then you take another X-ray to see if it's working. And that's a pretty logical way to do it. So who can DEI leaders partner with to help them do this type of assessment? Are there any easy to use tools, online resources? Are there particular areas within the organization where this tends to reside, where the DEI leader can go and find out if this particular department is doing this, and if they can then partner with them to do this as part of their effort to drive more inclusion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of companies now that are doing network analytics internally. So just to start with that. That would be in your people analytics, talent, people analytics kind of environment. They're using them for different reasons, and often they don't think to use them around diversity and inclusion. So what they're often using them for is knowledge management, innovation, trying to see if the people who need to be talking to each other are talking to each other, is sales information being distributed throughout the sales team, are geographies being excluded, are parts of the organization who are supposed to be innovating together, actually innovating together, or are they sticking in their same old clusters? Are there bridges between different groups, and who are those bridge people? And are they being rewarded for doing that bridge work, or are they actually bringing people together? Are they pushing them apart? So there's a lot of reasons why people would do network analytics that don't have anything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion per se. So I think a good first step for anyone, particularly from a large organization, is to see if people are already in-house doing this. And so it might be a matter of just intersecting what you know about gender diversity, national origin, or whatever you're looking at with what's already going on and partnering with that. So that's one thing that I would suggest. I've seen increasingly CHROs are getting interested in this for also a variety of reasons, not the least of which is bringing in those newcomers a little more quickly because that's so expensive, right? It takes a long time for them to be fully embedded. How can you bring them in more quickly? Certain industries, I think, are a little bit ahead of the game. So I know consulting industries, because it's so important, the relationships there, they tend to do quite a lot of internal examination of their connections. But other than that, other than internally, there are some nice tools out there. If you're handy yourself, there's a tool called Node Excel, which is out there and freely available, has really nice graphics. The gold standard in academia is something called UCINet. My dissertation advisor was the designer of that. And it's a complex program, but it's a really flexible program that allows you to do more sophisticated analytics than just cutting up and seeing where people are on the network. You can do something a lot more sophisticated with it. And then there's a bunch of external consultants that do network analyses. There's one group that I think does a particularly good job called Polynode. That's the name of a program, or Andrew Pitts, that runs that group that I think does a very nice job. And there's people like me that can do the network analysis or work with the people who do the network analyses to sort of bring what I know about what to look for to the analysis and to the interpretation so that you can get something a little bit more sophisticated. And maybe do some interviews of people in key areas. So for instance, one thing that I've worked with some companies on is when you find people, when there's some kind of consistent pattern around who's around the edges of the organization. So maybe it's women. Maybe a lot of women are on the periphery. And we know that that's a flight risk. And not only is it a flight risk, but their expertise isn't getting pulled into the organization. So something you can do is called smart mentoring. You've identified people who are at risk, and now you can identify some people who are central. And you can connect those people in the periphery with the people who are more central. So unlike what we often do is we collect someone who's in the same industry or in the same function or something like that, or in the geography, now we can just connect them based on people who are not very well connected with people who are well connected. You can even start sort of a council of mentors, those people who are in the center. What are they learning? What are their best practices? How do they share that and distribute it? And then you could take that snapshot and see if it's working. Take a snapshot, identify some people who could use your support, and then take the snapshot, 6 months, a year, or whatever is the right time frame for you to see if it's working. So I think there's, it also, in each organization, is set up a little bit how their chief diversity officer operates, whether it's sort of they need to partner with the businesses or they work as part of human resources. You know better than I do, Joe, that those are different organizations. So there's a lot of resources out there for people.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about this is that it really allows you to literally re-engineer the way people are connected in your organization. And you keep using that word intentional, and I think that's important to underscore that as well. You can literally re-engineer a lot of the connections that already exist in your organization and optimize them. And you can use different types of interventions to do that, and then use tools like the ones that you just listed before, tools or services, tools that may already exist in your organization to measure the progress of that work that you're doing. One of the things that I thought of was you might have, let's say, for example, an employee network. Let's say you have a women's employee network, or you have an API network sitting out there. And when you look at the organizational network analysis map, you notice that, well, this community is very intact and very connected, and they've got a lot of connections to each other, but they're disconnected perhaps from power centers in the organization that it would be good for them to be connected to. They would have more influence and the ability to drive more value to the organization and to have their voices heard if they were connected to that. Well, if we know that, we can now take some intentional steps to try to create those connections. So it not only helps us to connect individuals that may be working remotely in this new environment, maybe out in the peripheral areas of our organization, but it also helps us to take groups that we already have and possibly get more value out of them and for them by connecting them to the centers of power and the centers of activity within our companies. And I would imagine that this is going to be something that's going to be getting even more and more vital as we continue to go forward in the next couple of years, because we're not going back to the way things were. If anything, we are moving further away. Just the other day, I saw a chart that showed how there are organizations, a small amount still, maybe somewhere between 15 and 16%, that have experimented with having meetings in the metaverse. So, I mean, that's another avenue where people are going to start getting together and using that to create a more full experience than when you have a meeting, let's say across Zoom or Teams. But nevertheless, again, that creates another environment where there's another pocket of people working. Are there any other things like that that you're seeing out there that tell you that ONA is moving from something that was good to have because it added value to the organization to something that I think is vital and becoming increasingly more vital to understand and to utilize?
You're seeing it used somewhat as an accountability tool as well, because you can kind of see it as a 360 on steroids. Because you're asking, for instance, if you do a survey and then you ask, who gives you career advice? Then you can take a look and you can say, all right, we set up a formal sponsorship program, but people aren't nominating these people as though we're giving them career advice. So they're clearly going through the motions. They're having these meetings, but it's not having the effect that we want it to have. Or you might very well find that, yes, there's a couple of managers who are doing this really well, that are the central hubs, and maybe they're overburdened with it because this is often uncompensated work where people are providing that kind of help and access and things like that. So I think we'll see much more of that. And in going deeper into the idea of it as being an accountability tool. So this is a way of seeing, all right, we've tasked people with making sure that they are bringing on diverse talent. Now we're going to take a look at the organizational network and we're going to see, is the talent that's around them and interacting with them on a regular basis diverse? Sure, they may all be in their department, but are they actually having that kind of connection with each other? And you can do that as a way, this accountability tool, but also as a way of, identifying people who might need support in understanding strategies for doing that, and identifying people who obviously have some strategies that are working and you can codify for, lots of stuff. I think we're going to need, and I see this with the people who have the most diverse and well-connected networks, they're using their meeting times more creatively. So it's not meetings just to get the work done. It is meetings that incorporate finding out about each other's projects, and in ways that build connection. I've seen everything from, creating a deck of PowerPoints where each PowerPoint, it's like a baseball card, right? That's got someone's picture, and then there's sort of statistics and highlights and areas of strength, and and I breed cats, or whatever it is that they do. And so you know who to reach out to and have some things that you can talk to about that person. I've seen people use sort of a random wind generator so that every week people put into a literal or a figurative jar wins for them for the week. And then each and then people take them randomly and discuss them. And the idea is that you're not only learning about and celebrating wins for each other, but understanding why that's a win. And in doing that, you understand what are the challenges that person is facing, and you become more able to connect and help that person, to learn from that person, to share what's worked for you with that person. So I think there's a lot that can be done, and I don't see it going away anytime soon, honestly. Particularly, like I said, I collect stuff using surveys, but a lot of people do it scraping emails or taking a look at other existing data that companies already have, and then just using a network analysis on them.
Interesting enough, also, when you look at a network analysis map and you notice that pockets of people are disconnected, let's say from that center, and you've got your leadership here and they're all clustered together and interconnected, and then you've got some division point, and then you've got all these other clusters. I think for many organizations, that can also sound an alarm, because clearly the people in the organization tend to reflect the opinions of the buying public or the consumers who buy their products or services, or even the institutional buyers who sometimes are involved in transactions in buying or securing their services. So if you've got a leadership team that's over here, and they're well clustered and they're the power base, but they're making decisions about what to put out there, what to offer, and so forth. And it's disconnected from the general group down here that's made up of these different diverse demographics, which are similar to the diverse demographics that are out there in the world that they're trying to sell these products. They've got a disconnect not only between them and their workforce, but they're disconnected also from their market. So I would say that's another thing that, as the world becomes more dispersed and distributed, becomes even another reason why organizations need to use tools like this in order to understand where are they in terms of how they were connected to each other. And then as they take steps to try to improve those conditions, are they making progress? What should they double down on? What should they just stop doing altogether and maybe refocus their resources on something else? Inga, thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate having you here again. And I'm sure this is not going to be our last interview. I always say that to you at the end, and it's been prophetic up to this point that we will meet again to have a discussion like this. We're going to open up for Q&A. I will say one thing for people who will be watching this as a video. If you're watching this as a video that you got from my Loom platform, then when you look down at the bottom of the video, you'll see some emojis down there, and then to the right you'll see a comment box, and you will also see a record box. If you click on the comment box, you can interact with me and all of your other colleagues that are included in this meeting. Or if you choose to record, your comment or question will be distributed to all of your colleagues, and they'll also be able to respond back. So this gives us an opportunity to have these discussions asynchronously if you're not able to make it to the meeting that we're having today. So with that, I'm going to close the recording. Inga, thank you again for being here.